Hello, and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. Business seems to be the most powerful force in the world, perhaps more so than government these days. The largest corporations, only 20 companies, are responsible for 1/3 of carbon emissions, and some firms carry more economic heft than many nations. For example, Apple earns $99 billion in net income in 2022, and if Apple were a nation, it would rank 68th in the world by income. The climate crisis and related food, water, and immigration crises present the greatest challenge business has ever faced. Can they deliver a better world and equitable society in order to avoid a global economic collapse? That thought occurred to me over and over as I read a new book, The Activist Leader, A New Mindset for Doing Business, by our guests, Jon-Miller and Lucy Parker. There's no doubt that business will remain a force as long as there's a functioning economy. Even in socialist countries, business drives a lot of the delivery of goods and services. Lucy and John's book traces the threads reshaping expectations of corporate leaders, from the rise of the activist shareholder and activist employees to external influences like the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of environmental, social, and governance-oriented investing, which of course is known as ESG. And then there's the climate crisis and everything that comes with it. Jon-Miller and Lucy Parker lay out a simple challenge for leaders and people who want to rise to be business leaders. They must adopt a new mindset, the ability to think like an activist about the role a business plays in the world. Now, that's a tall order in a fractured political environment in which every word is parsed from all the extremes of the political spectrum to find problems and create controversy. It takes courage to be an activist leader, and that's a topic worth exploring in a world that needs business, not just government and individuals, to step up to its responsibility for the system that produced climate change. You can find The Activist Leader, A New Mindset for Doing Business, at Amazon, Powell's Books, and local bookstores. Look for links in the article that accompanies this podcast. Let's get into the conversation. Welcome to the show, John and Lucy. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Very good, and glad to be with you.
Pretty good.
Now, I want to start off by, it's a pretty basic question. How did you come to write the book? Was there a moment or a leader that you met that spurred your recognition that the role of the CEO has and is changing?
Well, so Lucy and I have been working together with businesses, with leaders of businesses for some 12 years now. And in that time, you know, the kind of questions that we're being asked have changed quite a lot. We spent quite a lot of time in conversation with business leaders in the early days, you know, talking about why they need to get engaged with these kind of critical societal issues. We find ourselves having that conversation less frequently these days. It's much less about the why should you get engaged, much more about the how. What does it actually mean to grab hold of some of these, you know, really pressing challenges that society is worried about in a meaningful way and take action on that from the core of your business? And of course, it's a really hot topic for society these days. Everybody wants to know, you know, how a business is responding to the climate crisis, how a business is responding to, you know, issues of inequality in the world, issues of social justice. There are no shortage of really pressing, urgent global challenges, and businesses are often part of them. And so what a central premise for us of the book is that what it takes to lead a business in today's world is different. And we've seen what that looks like through the work that we've done, and we wanted to write about that.
There are patterns that emerge very, very clearly, and actually most businesses can hardly see them themselves because they're right in the throes of it. And if you've seen it across lots and lots of businesses, it just felt to us, actually, this isn't a mystery. The people who do it really well are doing it against certain principles. So we were spelling out those principles because these days, if you're going to lead a business, the financial has to go hand in hand with the social has to go hand in hand with the financial, not one at the cost of the other. And so helping people answer the practicality of how is what we were trying to do.
Well, let me ask Lucy, what is an activist leader? And how would you compare the activist leader in a corporation to one in a social movement, like, for instance, the civil rights movement that you've compared this to early in the book?
It's a great question, because some business figures, business leaders will say to us, oh, it's a very difficult term. It's a very difficult term, an activist, because currently a lot of business leaders are on the receiving end of activism, shareholder activism, NGO activism, even employee activism. So they'll often say to us, oh, I'm not mad about the activists, because they are, and they have a list of words that often come out, unreasonable, aggressive, sort of utopian, unrealistic, in other words. But actually, one of the things we were trying to convey is, for companies that step up really effectively to these social questions that are now on their radar screen, they are actually acting according to the same set of rules that activists all over the world in any subject, in any sector, have always yielded to. And if you put it like this, you can feel people lean in and actually want to be one. So I think what we would say is, at an essence, an activist leader is looking at a big, intractable, difficult problem and going, something needs to change about this. This really needs to change. And instead of going, somebody needs to do something about it, they go, I think I've got something to do with this. I need to do something about it. And that comes out of wanting to mobilize others, mobilize resources, mobilize action, not because you can fix the whole problem, but you see you've got levers to pull. And I think what's happening in business today is they're starting to see that they've got a lot of levers to pull on these big questions, and they need to lean in. That's activism.
And does that mean then that that represents business opportunity purely and simply, or does it mean that the opportunity for the business to shape the society it operates in is a bigger and more important opportunity, especially given the continuing rise in the size of business as compared to government?
My instinctive answer to that is that it's actually a synthesis of the two.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was a sort of generation before, let's call it 5 years or so ago, Paul Polman would be a poster child of this era, where there was a kind of exceptionalism about it. I really believe this has to happen. I'm going to do it. Where if you take, say, Mark Schneider, who we interview in the book and who runs the biggest food company in the world, really, in Nestle, he's saying, what I actually have to do is make this commercially attractive and strong, and at the same time have an impact on the issue. And there is a synthesis. That is the pattern of leadership today, is to bring the two together. And it shouldn't be so mysterious, because after all, companies do that with their regular products and services. It's got to be of value to the consumer or customer and of value to the corporate and its shareholders. So it's a similar equation. How do you make it work for both?
Well, Mark Schneider makes the point that there's a big difference between being an activist and a zealot. What is that difference, and how can a business leader apply that thinking?
Well, I mean, you know, the typical images that come to mind when you use the word activist are very much like, you know, the people on the street creating a noise, creating disruption, raising the issue, you know, with the placards and banners. And of course, that's an important part of what it means to be an activist. But actually, what's often overlooked is that activism also requires an enormous degree of pragmatism. Mm-hmm. Real activism is about making things happen. It's about actually creating change. And that's a huge mindset, actually. And so the kind of popular images, it's why, as Lucy was saying, you know, when we sometimes use the word activism with some of these business leaders, they don't automatically jump in and go, yeah, that's me. Because it's not the popular kind of imagination about what an activist is, but creating change, applying what your business can do at a very you know, operational level, taking it into the core of the business, understanding what how to integrate these issues into your strategic priorities as a business. That all requires a huge degree of practicality and pragmatism. And so, you know, we often think of this very much as like, it's not just about creating a noise. This is about making real things happen, having an actual impact on the issues that businesses are faced with and intrinsically a part of.
A lot of the characters in the book lead very large organizations, but does this also apply to a small business? And what advice would you have for just an entrepreneur seeking to make a change in the world partially through their business?
Well, I think maybe a couple of things. I mean, for all businesses of all shapes and sizes, you know, if you're looking to appeal to a next generation of customer or consumer, if you're looking to engage the next generation of employees, if you're looking to make sure you've got solid, reliable supply chains, there are license to operate questions. The regulatory environment is always changing. If you're looking to future-proof what you do as a business, then these are issues that you need to be mindful of. And all businesses are part of the system. And one of the big shifts that we're talking about in this book is the shift from businesses thinking we need to manage this bit that's under our immediate control, to thinking it's also our role to think about the health of the systems in which we operate. And all businesses of all sizes are part of systems, and as I say, these are systemic issues. And
one of the things I think that happens with the big businesses is that we map out 9 steps in the book, and one of the things that happens with businesses is that they walk along this path thinking, what can I do about it? And with an activist mindset, if you look at the leaders in this space today, every single one of them is working for systemic change. The leaders are all driving for systemic change, and it's probably the biggest differentiator from a generation before. If you had to pick one of the 9 that differentiates what is happening today and why it feels energetic and progressive, it's that thing of seeing yourself in a system. And it doesn't matter whether the business is big or small, you can act on those principles.
So as we're speaking, I can hear Milton Friedman spinning in his grave. There's a high whine permeating the business world as you say these words. So we're addressing externalities, but I think inevitably we had to, because the influence of business has grown so much over the past 50 years.
Yes.
Can a business exist now without becoming politically engaged? Or and there was you went back and forth on this throughout the book. People were debating whether this was political or simply participating in society. How would you characterize it?
Maybe there's two ways of looking at that. Mm-hmm. One is we quite often meet the question, I think you're pointing at it, that the dialogue today around the role of business has become politicized. In a couple of ways. It's both become contentious. In America in particular, it's become politicized. And also there's a kind of, should businesses speak up on issues that are political or geopolitical? I think what we're really looking at is what is the role of business in the wider world? And almost the first base premise is, what are the topics that you should focus on as a business? What are the issues that are intrinsic to you and your impact in the world, rather than joining in a political debate in any particular way? It's, if you are in pharmaceutical industry, you know that there are 4 or 5 big issues that challenge the pharmaceutical industry: access to medicines, pricing of medicines, antimicrobial resistance, etc., counterfeiting. Are you on the issues that are really close to your business? And then, interestingly, you start asking a different question. What is the role of the business and the sector versus the role of government to come together on these issues? That's different from, can you avoid politics? Because government and policy does one job, business and enterprise does another job. And if you're going to tackle any of these issues, you need the two working together to a similar end. That's quite different from what people are often referring to when they say political, by which they mean, do you have to join in the political noise today?
So in the book, we present 9 steps for how to think like an activist. And actually what we're talking about here is step 1, which we call focus. So yes. How do you decide as a business leader where to focus? Because there are an absolutely overwhelming amount of, potential issues coming at you. And they all seem urgent and important. How are you supposed to decide which you respond to, which you don't respond to, which you want to seriously engage with a proper intention to make an actual impact, and which you maybe want to, deal with properly, but not prioritize in that way? And I think for us, that's very much the key to it, that which issues are you materially, intrinsically involved with is really the question. And then it's not a secret. These issues aren't hiding. They're in plain sight. Actually, they're screaming out loud. It doesn't mean that you have to, just because you're a business leader and you have a voice, doesn't mean you have to speak out on every single issue in the world that people are asking about. What it does mean is that you have to engage meaningfully with the issues that your business is really a part of.
Well, and you're right that taking a position is as likely to cost a company as not taking one. And that's an important insight. Both options are a position. So how can a leader assess their options in one of these sticky situations? And I would point, for instance, to Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, who made public statements vis-a-vis the Roe versus Wade decision being overturned, and even helped some of his employees move out of one state in particular because they were going to ban abortions. Was that going too far, or was Mark talking to his employees more than he was talking to the public?
Well, do you know the really interesting thing about this question is it points to the fact that what it means to lead a business has changed so fundamentally. The experience of a business leader has changed so fundamentally, even in the last 10 years. I mean, for example, we've worked with a CEO of a major global fast food company whose first job was working in a restaurant in that fast food company. He's still with the company. Now he's the CEO. Similarly, we worked with the CEO of a major global retailer whose first job was working on the counter in one of the stores of that retailer. He's still with the company. Now he's the CEO. The point of saying this is that, these leaders know everything about their business. They know the ins and outs of their business. And as businesses have grown in scale, now they are significant actors in society. And so the leaders of these businesses are now, whether they like it or not, de facto, they are leaders in society. So people want to know what they think, right? And so you mentioned Mark Benioff. Someone like Mark Benioff absolutely feels it's his place to have a point of view on some of the issues like the ones you mentioned, or even describes himself as an activist on some of these issues. There are plenty of other business leaders who think it's absolutely not their role to speak out on these issues. Now, there's an adaptation there. There's a learning there. And I think for us, the key thing is there is so much focus on whether business leaders speak out on this or speak out on the other thing. What we're really interested in is, what are they actually doing? What are businesses actually doing on these issues? And to be honest, a lot of the noise even around who says what and have they done this and changed that on their Instagram account, it's a distraction. We need business leaders to be absolutely prioritizing the material impacts of their businesses on society, the role they play in the systems that they operate in, the externalities that they're throwing off. And there are plenty of leaders doing that, not enough. And so we would ask a slightly different set of questions, actually.
I wonder whether a way of looking at it, sorry, just to build on that, I wonder whether a way of looking at it is, you very often hear, what should we speak up on? It was implicit in what you're saying. Has somebody gone too far? They're talking about abortion. I know about fast food, but I'm talking about abortion. And a different way of framing that is not how do you speak up on a question, but how do you show up on a question? Mm-hmm. And the people who actually succeed in these territories are because they are very clear in their business that they are acting on that issue, whether it's for their employees because they have a view on the rights of how they look after their employees, on whether it's LGBTQ plus or whether it's women's rights or whatever, and that's what's leading them to speak. So the people who succeed in the public discourse are because it's clear their business is already doing something on this. And I think that the part of the reframing here of the role of business in these questions is, when we began, as John said, it was peripheral. You might choose to join in, and probably your response was philanthropic. What you're seeing now is the world is actually saying, what we're asking you to deal with is major externalities. And that's actually what's prompting a lot of this debate. Very interesting, you could look at living wage, you could look at climate. Your business has an operating model that excludes these questions. And when you talk about Milton Friedman and spinning in his grave, Absolutely. Some people find this complicated to discuss. But the point we're making is not you should deal with all of these other things to show you're good or because the world is asking you to. But the long-term sustainable profitability of your business is going to require this. And so it is actually, again, this synthesis of how do you develop a management style, a leadership style that carves a pathway into the future for sustained profitability in a world that's changing very fast, whilst at the same time answering the question, are you acting on these issues in a way that's commensurate with the scale of the issue and the scale of the business?
Business was always presented 50 years ago as kind of separate from the rest of life. But what you're saying now is that we are so thoroughly embedded in life that we have to address it.
Absolutely. And it's being brought to the door of business because, you know, take for example, climate. I mean, we could go on forever about climate, but the pressure on climate is there is no sector, no business in the world anywhere that isn't going to be affected by adaptation to climate change. Regardless of regulation, regardless of what the capital markets are saying. And there was a very interesting case in southern Italy a month or two ago where a company that was providing electricity went out completely, the complete outage of their service. Why? Because in that very, very hot month that we all watched the news coverage of, the cables melted underground. And literally the leadership team and all their stakeholders went, oh, we just didn't think this would happen. We didn't think it would happen so soon. They're not looking at the pressure points of these issues coming in to the risk mitigation and resilience for their own long term.
So an activist leader can't blithely ignore reality and becomes engaged with reality.
Yeah. And the reason it's activism is to the very point you say about Milton Friedman and his spinning grave, is actually to decide to do that takes some conviction and some leadership today, because the model for decades now has been that you don't do that. And so you have to have the conviction to step into the space and go, the world has changed. If the world has changed, we have to change how we respond a bit. Not because we don't believe in capitalism or don't want long-term success of the business, but have you seen how the world is changing? Shouldn't we be acting differently in the light of that to sustain the profitability and excitement of the business?
There is an interesting thing. We seem to be mentioning Milton Friedman a lot. Just to say, so we talk about this a little bit in the book too, because we have slightly made a cartoon out of Milton Friedman a bit, you know, along with, you know, sort of Gordon Gekko and the Wolf of Wall Street. It's a bit like if you actually read what Milton Friedman says, absolutely, he's saying that the role of directors is to make as much money as possible for shareholders whilst operating within the rules of society. That's a really, really important caveat. It's literally the second half of the sentence, which everybody just kind of drops off. And it's an interesting way he puts it too. He doesn't say whilst, you know, respecting the laws, national laws of the countries in which business operates or anything like that. He's saying operating within the rules of society. You know, so he is talking about a set of broader expectations which companies need to be sensitive to and to respond to. And also there's of course, the very related concept of fiduciary responsibility, which people always mention in this kind of context, in this conversation, which is likewise a much misunderstood concept, which we talk about in the book. Interestingly, the law firm Freshfields did a global study of company law to provide some clarity on this. And their conclusion was nowhere in no piece of company law legislation anywhere in the world are company directors prohibited from considering the interests of other stakeholders other than shareholders. It even says in some cases they may be required to consider interests of other stakeholders in order to safeguard the long-term profitability of the company. So I think it's quite useful just to kind of collapse some of the myths around what Milton Friedman actually says and what fiduciary duty actually says. But all of that aside, that's a very sort of academic and theoretical conversation. If you're actually in a business at a senior level right now, the imperative to respond to these issues is loud and clear and undeniable.
This is a great place to take a quick commercial break because that's the point we need to talk about next. We'll be right back. And we are back to continue the discussion with Lucy Parker and Jon Miller, co-authors of The Activist Leader, A New Mindset for Doing Business. So there's a quote from J.P. Morgan Chase CEO in the book, Jamie Dimon, about listening to a critic, somebody from the community, then going back, doing some research and finding, as he put it, the real problem and addressing it. And you used this word earlier, Lucy, that's reframing. Is this in a sense, an activism that allows the enterprise to market itself as well as to act more responsibly within society in order to increase its potential profitability?
Maybe the entry point to that thought in our experience is a slightly different entry point,
okay,
which is that in our experience, when businesses decide to take on a critical issue that they are intrinsically involved with, and you cite the JP Morgan Chase one, as a bank, they said prosperity in communities is our business. It's an intersection. And banks make lots of money, and communities are prosperous if the money flows in the community. Let's actually show what we could do. So they moved into cities, their city program, which is what that was referring to. Their city program picked some cities and decided to work out how, in practice, they could work with that community to lift prosperity. So they brought what they can do, which is lending, funding. So they created affordable housing opportunities, they backed small enterprises and so on. Crucially, then they worked with community organizations, building skills, et cetera, and then they started to advocate amongst the city networks as to what would build prosperity, against an ambition that if you worked hand in hand, you would actually lift the game. Now, the reason for spelling that out is that one of the things we have is the sort of leadership model in our picture, which is what are you doing in the business? What are you doing beyond the business? And how do you speak up and share that learning to accelerate others? Now, the particular point you mentioned, which is go into the community and find out what needs doing, is really interesting because that's applying a core business skill set of data and research to go, if we're going to do this, let's surround it with, bed it down with information about what we're trying to achieve. So that actually moved it suddenly from being not just a philanthropic play to an actual operational play to scope the problem. Now, your next question was, does that help the market? If over time they build authentic reputation for demonstrating how they have created that uplift and it builds their reputation, great. That's what we want businesses to have a good reputation for. Greenwashing, marketing through those activities, as in you're not really doing it, but you've got a good story to tell, forget that. It becomes very, very clear when businesses are actually doing it and they can deliver the proof points and they're using their own core capabilities and skills and resources to deliver that change, and they can prove it.
So what used to be called corporate social responsibility, which was kind of wallpaper, has actually moved to be a core competence within the organization, and the organization, to some extent, is integrating those roles into executive leadership.
Yes, and indeed, when John was referring to the mapping out of the steps, one of the absolutely crucial steps is putting it into the core of leadership. And one of the examples we use actually is Coca-Cola on plastics, because they are the biggest plastic polluter in the oceans in the world, and they decided to do something about it. And when we were interviewing the CEO there and said, how did you do that? His answer was really straightforward, and he kept repeating it. You just put it into your strategy as you would anything else. You want the data, you want the plan, you want them to report to you how they're improving on it, you want to publish it transparently. Just run it as you would any other piece of strategy. And of course, these issues used to be outside the purview of business. Now they're in the core of business. And the secret of success is that you run them as you would run any other part of the business and expect people to deliver on in the same sort of way.
Now, in the climate crisis era, one of the major changes in the way business needs to operate is that we need to change entire supply chains, which implies giving up some competitive advantage. How are activist CEOs thinking about making changes that can reduce not just their organization's impact, but the entire industry's organizational impact without losing that marketing advantage?
I mean, I think from our point of view, not necessarily immediately a question of competitive advantage, but you're looking at the complete set of commercial imperatives driving businesses to engage with climate. I mean, if you look at issues like water at the moment, it's just extraordinary to see, the global semiconductor supply chains being disrupted by droughts in Taiwan, or you have like mustard, which is absolutely a key ingredient for food manufacturers around the world. Mustard supply chains just drying up because of massive droughts in major producing countries like Canada, or the Panama Canal at the moment is still working at half speed because it's running out of water. And there are worries that it might actually shut completely, which is just an extraordinary disruption to global trade routes. And so the imperatives for companies to take seriously the impacts of climate change, and the imperative for the business world to engage with climate as an issue that needs preventing, getting worse. That's loud and clear. And so the issues around, if you're talking about the systemic issue, the systemic action that's needed, by definition, that systemic transformation just scoops up all businesses.
Does that mean the traditional focus on confidentiality within organizations needs to be radically rethought so that we begin to collaborate to solve these systemic problems?
It's so interesting you say that, because what you quite often hear from the people leading projects like this on the inside of businesses is you can hear them literally say, we had to work with our competitors in a completely different way. Now, actually, that sounds incredibly radical. But if you take engineering industries or even pharmaceutical industries, there's a long tradition of pre-competitive collaboration to get things off the ground that are very difficult. And businesses are very sophisticated about holding the bit that is theirs and competitively sensitive, and meanwhile working with others to get things off the ground that will lift the whole industry. So when earlier we were saying that perhaps the most definitive characteristic of leaders in this social value space is being able to work systemically, one of the things we point at is what we've called activist coalitions. So what you quite often see is people coming together across an industry, maybe even some players from the same industry, and then across the value chains. And they sort of swarm, if you like, they come together to fix a particular problem, like water in the supply chain. And what the other thing you see, which you mentioned, a very interesting thing, if you look at, for example, what Walmart's done on biodiversity, they have thousands of suppliers. So if they're asking themselves the central question that we think businesses in the social value space are asking themselves, how do we actually change the game on biodiversity? Well, why? Because we have a lot of our product that ends up or comes out of the soil. We cannot sustain those supply chains. So they actually went and educated themselves about the challenge of biodiversity and soil health. They pulled together 2,000 suppliers and they educated them through the same people who they had been educated by. This is the problem about pollination. This is the problem about soil health. This is the problem about ocean acidification. And then they asked them, what are you going to be to that? So the leverage they have to pull the levers across their supply chain is extraordinary, because by doing that, they're raising the base of the entire industry. So that's a very activist, proactive mindset to saying, if we're really trying to solve that problem, we can't do it alone. What levers can we pull? Who can we mobilize to change the game? And they're using all their business nous and resources and supply chains to make it happen.
It's really easy to understate how radical that shift is for people leading a business. It's a very different way of thinking about what it means to run a business, to actually think that part of your role is to be part of those systemic transformations, because all of these businesses, if you're talking about climate, of course, you're talking about the energy system, but you're also talking about the food system, you're talking about, tech infrastructure systems, you're talking about global health systems. I mean, businesses are intrinsic parts of all of those systems. And what's being asked of business leaders today is to take a step out of thinking only of these issues through the lens of the interests of their business, but understanding what role do they play as systemic actors, and how can that role be a part of transforming those systems and addressing those issues. So that's a really radical shift in what it means to lead a business.
Well, you also point out that CEOs often make these activist decisions based on their personal experience, and maybe a family member points out an issue to them. What should a CEO be exposing themselves to, opening themselves up to, in order to be connected to the world at the level you're talking about?
What a great question.
Wonderful question. It's our heart as well, because I mean, one of the things that often strikes us when we're working with these big companies is the extent to which, when you're inside one of these companies, like the outside world can seem a very long way away. Yeah. It's very easy to kind of, start to see the world through the world view.
You're on the campus. You never off the campus.
Yeah. You're in the mindset, absolutely. And what we've seen many times is that it all starts from a personal moment, and it can be a provocative question asked by an employee in a town hall meeting, or a provocative question asked by a teenage child around the kitchen table, or it can be an encounter with someone from an NGO, or a meeting with a person from a vulnerable community. There are many ways in which it happens, but what we often find is that those leaders that have that spirit of activism about them, at some point, there's been that flip in them, and they've looked at what needs to change, and they've gone, I need to do something about this. We need to do something about this. This is relevant to us as a business. We're part of this. And then it all flows from there. So it is personal, but that's the beginning.
And there's actually a very practical thing that people can do in the business, I think, which is, in fact, it's our second step, is what we call perspective. Get a picture of the issue you're dealing with from the perspective of people who are really close to it, really understand the issue, and are outside your business. It's really striking to me that when we sort out some of the people who you might think of as leaders, and perhaps in businesses which mean to be leaders as CEOs change, as somebody becomes a CEO or takes on one of these big roles, they very often put in place a program for themselves to go out and meet the challenges. And it completely transforms how they from then on react as a leader in that business. Because they actually just say, talk to me, why are you so bothered? That was partly why when we were talking about biodiversity earlier in Walmart, really striking, the entire leadership team got very interested and excited by learning from people who actually were concerned about the issue. And of course, if you are leading a business and you're on, say, a product development thing, you ask people to bring you research. That you can ask people to bring you research on the latest trends in that issue in exactly the same practical way that you do if you were developing a product. And most businesses don't do that.
So that's easy for a CEO to do, relatively speaking, to get that kind of resource. What advice do you have for younger, early career people who are seeking to lead in an activist way in the future? How should they invest in their career development and their exposure to the world that they live in?
I think, again, there are some practical things that people can do. Typically, if you're making your way up through your working life, one of the things that is very helpful is to bring a perspective to your colleagues, including senior colleagues, that they may not have had. So that thing we've just been talking about, have you actually seen what people are saying about the problem of plastic in the ocean? Have you actually seen what people are saying about the problem on living wage? And I remember us working with a leadership team where plastic was one of the issues. And the formula, the mechanism that we've just been talking about actually was unlocked by quite a junior person who was a technical packaging expert. And she had been trying to get the leadership to understand the problem of plastic. And in the end, she took them to the recycling sites. And when we were working alongside her, we actually helped her create the case that went, do you see what's happening in the world about plastic? And by the way, now let's put that against what we put into the world as plastic waste. And literally the executive team said what John said a moment ago. Oh, wow, I hadn't really seen that we are actually part of that. And we don't want to leave this business and not have done anything about it, do we? We really think on our watch we're just going to close our eyes to that? And if you can make that connection between what your business is to the thing the world outside is worried about, you can start acting. And often young people and junior people are in a very good position to bring fresh perspectives on that into their own teams.
Climate change is a multi-generational undertaking. And how does a CEO or a senior leader in an organization put policy in place that will outlast their tenure? That really ultimately is the big challenge with greenwashing. There's a lot of claims made that we're going to do this because the CEO who's making the claim will not be there. So how do we make that genuine?
Well, I think that's a great, the tension between the long term and the short term was definitely something when Lucy and I first started working together that was loud and clear as a tension that needed to be resolved. To be honest, it's less a tension than we might think these days, because the short term and the long term have collapsed into each other. The issues are no longer just issues in the future; they're issues in the present tense. Businesses are having to respond, in real time to the impacts of many of the crises that we talk about in the book and that we're well aware of. But there are also, as you say, these are issues that need sustained long-term strategies and an investment basis that will support those sustained long-term strategies. And that shift is happening. Investors are starting to ask for that. The regulatory frameworks and environments that support that are strengthening, and we can expect to see much more of that happen. And then on a very personal level, you do meet lots of business leaders who, when they're thinking about their tenure in office, they will say to you, it would be a shame if I get to the end of this period and the only thing I've got to show for it is the numbers. They are asking, what did it all amount to other than profits for shareholders? Not enough of them are asking that, but they do exist.
After having spent all the years that you have with these activist leaders, how do you envision the economy changing as business continues to grow in size and scale? And we solve the climate crisis. What does a company look like in 20 years? Is it a full life cycle participant in life as compared to somebody who just sells you stuff?
I love that phrase, a full life cycle participant in life. Absolutely. Well, that would be a great vision. And, and there are signs that that's possible, especially on the full life cycle part of the question. When you have people like Maersk, the shipping company, building ships that are designed to be completely disassembled so that every part can be reused, a circular ship, who knew? That's hugely encouraging. Or when you have people like Philips, who have, stopped selling light bulbs only, now they sell lighting. So lighting as a service, so that they can reclaim the materials in the light bulbs. So they've disrupted their own business model. The thing is, we need more than circular companies. We need a circular economy, right?
Yeah,
and so,
I think one of the things that's very helpful is to forgive us for not having the answer, by which I mean all of us, because nobody's carved out the path we're trying to walk now, if you take climate. There are no answers. So all that can actually be asked is, with the levers you can pull, with the resources you have, with the space you have to act in, are you doing your best? And the world is asking very big companies, is that commensurate with the scale of the issue and commensurate with the scale of the company? And one of the things that we're seeing more and more is that the companies that act in the most imaginative and effective way are responding to the call out to the problem. It's back to this thing of understand the problem. So if you looked at climate, what are we actually seeing the call out is for in the world, all over the world, and you can see it every day? We're asking for more energy. The world is asking still for more energy. And yet that energy needs to be disassociated from fossil fuels for the sake of everybody. So when you say, what could it look like? You're actually saying that it's it's got to solve that problem. So who's starting to go? What are the solutions to more energy, cleaner? And at the same time, what is being called out for is it's sometimes shortened to just economy, just transition. But actually what's being called for there is the inclusiveness of that. Not that it just serve the people who already have plenty of energy and have plenty of resources, but that the people taking the brunt of the early signs of climate change and will take even more brunt as it escalates, that we're including those communities, whether they're communities within a developed world or communities within a still developing world. So you can see the problems that are being called for. And I think our view, and the view of many leaders, is those solutions are going to come out of the implementation power, the innovation power, the collective resources and collaborativeness of businesses being full actors in it. So I think what we'll see is, if you say so happily, just suppose we solve the climate crisis, it will be more energy, cleaner, more inclusively, and business has to be part of that solution. And we have to invite them to help carve the path out. This is not clear. And it's that imaginative power, that innovative power to look at new business models, new shapes, new ways of doing things that we're calling forth.
And a thing that gives us some hope is, we have a line in the book, actually, which the publishers took out of the book and put on the book jacket, which is a line that's quite dear to our heart, which is that most people, when they look at the problems facing the world, feel powerless. But if you're a leader in a big business today, you're not powerless. And increasingly, business leaders recognize that they're not powerless, that maybe there is something that they can do. And, really, that's why we wrote the book, to try and help make more of that happen.
Well, I think it's that insight that one can be a continuously learning and engaged leader is the new business reality that we're facing. And I want to thank you both for spending time with us today, because this has been a very important conversation.
Thank you for inviting us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Mitch.
That was my conversation with Lucy Parker and Jon Miller, co-authors of The Activist Leader, A New Mindset for Doing Business. The book is available now on Amazon, at Powell's Books, and your local bookstores. As well, we will include links to buy a copy in the article that accompanies this podcast. Having forged the most complex economy in human history, business is inextricably tied to the social, economic, and ethical consequences of the system of production, distribution, collection, and reuse of the materials that we rely on in daily life. Jon and Lucy's book surveys that new reality in which business leaders must continuously learn and adapt strategy to changing realities. And I recommend you take the time to read it, whether you're a CEO, an early career employee looking to make a positive difference in the world, or even if you're just interested in how to influence the companies that you buy things from. Lucy's point that the answers to today's biggest question, climate change, are diverse, interconnected, and that the details of those answers are utterly unknown and cannot be known without extensive hands-on trials to find out what works, is critical to understanding how we can begin to navigate through the polycrisis. What we learn in one domain can have remarkable impacts in other aspects of daily life, but only if organizations keep an open mind and share what they learn by breaking down many of the barriers to collaboration that characterized the confidentiality-obsessed business practices of the 20th century. So, when a leader takes responsibility for making a change in society, they have to be in dialogue with society. They cannot simply impose this from the top down and expect everybody to go along with it. And that's the challenge of activist leadership. So I hope you'll take some time to read The Activist Leader and get a taste of what you can do to change the world for the better. And I also hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 430 interviews we've done on sustainability in your ear with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Please tell folks that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other places that they go for their podcast choice. If you take a moment to write a review, it would really help them find us. And you are the amplifier that help us spread more ideas to create less waste. So please, folks, take a moment to do so. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself